Vice President Kamala Harris has secured enough delegates to become the Democratic nominee. This comes as the campaign says it raised $310 million in July, more than double of what the Trump campaign brought in that time period. The enormous haul leaves the Harris campaign with $377 million in its war chest. Democrats have mobilized behind Harris, with 2/3 of donations made last month coming from first-time donors. All of this support is showing in the polls as Harris continues to close the gap between Trump and battleground states. Over on Trump's side, the former president continues to face backlash after making racially charged comments about his opponent, setting up a heated campaign between Harris that many had hoped would not turn to Harris's race. Joining me now to talk about these monumental fundraising numbers and what's next for the campaign as she prepares to make her vice presidential pick is the Hill's White House correspondent, Alex Gangitano. Alex, thank you so much for joining me here today. We know that the Harris campaign has turned on the Democratic money machine. Over 170,000 volunteers have signed up to help the campaign, and now she has secured enough delegates for the Democratic nomination. What is their attack plan going forward into November, and does this show a major grassroots movement behind her campaign?
That's right. She just was able to secure over the majority of the amount of delegates. So that means she has the votes needed. She's going to accept the nomination early next week and then announce her running mate. So this is all momentum that's behind her. She has wind behind her back going into the third week of her campaign. This July haul, the $310 million they were able to raise, that they said is the strongest grassroots month in presidential campaign history. And 2/3 of that haul came from first-time donors. So it really speaks to the grassroots movement behind her. Their campaign has stressed that the majority of money coming in is from these grassroots donors. And then next week, I talked about the momentum behind her. She's going to make her VP pick, and then she's headed to Pennsylvania with that selection. She's headed to states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada. This is all part of keeping up that momentum. So it lasts until the August 19th convention, and then it's a question of, can she ride this out past Labor Day into September, October, on those really pivotal months, or if this is something that's just this excitement right away because of what went on with moving her to the top of the ticket.
Yeah, and we obviously know from past presidential campaigns that period after Labor Day is really when that gap really narrows between the two campaigns. So we'll have to see what happens there. So while Harris is riding this really big wave of momentum behind her campaign launch and those massive fundraising efforts, Republicans are accusing her of hiding from the press because she has yet to do a sit-down interview or press conference as the Democratic nominee or presumptive nominee. Is there any strategy behind choosing not to do these press avails immediately after the launch of her campaign? And are Democrats pushing for her to, make herself more available to the press in that way?
Yeah, Democrats have been arguing during this Republican pushback against her not talking to the press is that she's been out on the trail. She's focused on talking to voters and this, grassroots movement that we talked about more so than talking to the press and staying in Washington. That she's been having these big rallies out in the state. She takes questions from the press when they're traveling with her. We did see her on the tarmac also last night, greeting the Americans who were newly freed from detainment in Russia, taking some questions from the press. So she does it in those kinds of settings. So we know that her campaign will point you to that when they're pushed on this. But Democrats argue that she's talking to the right people, which are voters, and that eventually, once things maybe calm down, once this swing state tour is over, she'll sit down with the media. But it definitely is a big difference than the way that we see Trump conduct himself, which he does hold these big rallies. He's often talking to his base, but he does also, call into Fox Business or give a quick interview with a reporter, and that he's constantly, making news that way as well. So it is a big difference in their campaign strategies so far. Again, we are just about 2 weeks into her campaign.
So we're just days away from a possible announcement of her VP pick. And while Harris weighs her choices for a running mate, we know that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz earlier this week emerged as a part of this broader conversation in the Veepstakes. So what would be the strategy behind picking Walz? Does he have the backing of Democrats inside of the party, or is he considered to be in some circles as too progressive for Harris's ticket?
Yeah, Walz definitely seemed to emerge pretty quickly. We see him on TV hits all the time. He has a lot of backing from Democrats in Congress. He served in the House for 12 years. He rose to be the top Democrat on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and then he headed back to Minnesota to run for governor in 2019. He definitely brings this Midwestern charm to the ticket, something you see on TV coming out of him, and they could balance out, the coastal attributes that Harris has from being from California. And his resume is really vast. He actually was the highest ranking enlisted soldier in the history of Congress. And lately, he has been such a staunch supporter of the Biden administration when you watch him on television. So Democrats in Congress that our colleagues have talked to said that he's one of their top picks, citing his pro-labor stance, his down-to-earth demeanor, his commitment to the Biden-Harris agenda. But he is considered a progressive, and that is something that Harris has been painted on as well and painted as well. I think she balanced out the ticket with moderate Joe Biden. And so she might be looking for more of a moderate choice. But definitely Democrats in Congress sang his praises this week to our colleagues. So it'd be interesting to see if he continues as one of the top choices as the next couple days go by, which is really crunch time for her to make her decision.
Right, and we know that Walz is really just one of a few contenders for the Veepstakes. Other names identified as front runners as for the Veepstakes are Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, and obviously Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. Alex, you reported on how many of these top candidates have established relationships with Vice President Harris. How would this play into who she chooses?
Yeah, that's right. In her time as Attorney General of California, a U.S. Senator, and then as Vice President, she has gotten to know a lot of these people who have been identified as frontrunners to join her ticket. Sources tell us that she wants someone who she vibes with, basically, because her and Joe Biden do have a close relationship and they do get along well. That was something that President Biden actually really stressed when he chose Vice President Harris as his running mate because of his relationship with President Obama. He wanted to be even closer. He wanted her at the table all the time. So they do have this really close relationship that I think she wants to recreate. So we're also told, she wants somebody though that she has a little bit of a relationship, a foundation with already, so she can create that, and someone who balances out the ticket. So Harris has stayed in touch with the Democratic Attorney Generals Association, which is made up of all the Democratic Attorney Generals across the country, which included Josh Shapiro, now governor of Pennsylvania, but previously Attorney General. It also includes Andy Beshear, who was the Attorney General of Kentucky before becoming governor. So she knows them from that background. Tim Walz served in Congress while she was in the Senate, but she has done work with him since becoming a vice president. And someone we haven't talked about yet, Pete Buttigieg, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, now the transportation secretary. Of course, they serve in the Biden administration together, so they know each other well. Harris also went out and campaigned for Shapiro when he was running for governor in 2022, and recently has had events just in the last couple months with Shapiro, Mark Kelly, senator from Arizona, and his wife, Gabby Giffords, who is a gun violence prevention advocate. She and Giffords have a close relationship and also has had events with Tim Walz. So she has this backstory with all of these possible selections.
No, definitely interesting to read the tea leaves, or at least try to read the tea leaves on these. I guess the only person who knows who she picks is Vice President Harris. And hey, maybe she doesn't know as of the time of this taping. We'll see. So I want to switch gears a little bit. The fallout is continuing for the Trump campaign after the president, or the former president, made racially charged comments this week about Vice President Harris, questioning her race and her heritage, and posting a picture of her on Truth Social mentioning her Indian heritage and even a copy of her birth certificate. Alex, how worried are Republicans inside of the party about these attacks and that this campaign could turn even uglier because of these comments?
I think Republicans, when they were talking to our colleagues at the Hill after the comments, basically say that they're uncomfortable by them. They're not really sure where to go now. Some try to dodge questions about if Trump had crossed the line by insisting these comments about a race were, appropriate and kept running with them. Well, some just didn't want to decline to comment at all. And something that Republicans have been warning Trump about for weeks, and now Senator J.D. Vance, his running mate, is that they need to focus on the policy, not these personal attacks. And what we saw from Trump this week definitely focused more on the personal attacks, talking about and mocking her because of her race. So I think they want to see her record on immigration, something that Trump wants to talk about way more than talking about her background. I think they're ready to talk about the economy. They're ready to talk about crime, all these things basically that they can argue that Harris is just an extension of President Biden and that a Harris presidency would look just like a Biden presidency. Those are all things Republicans want Trump to talk about. And they just find it uncomfortable when he goes into these personal attack territory.
Alex, I want to switch gears to actually some really good news that took place this week. President Biden announced the largest prisoner swap between the U.S. and its Western allies and Russia since the beginning of the Cold War, bringing home Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former Marine Paul Whelan. 24 prisoners in total were exchanged. Alex, what do we know about the full extent of the deal and of the additional prisoners that were released?
Yeah, this was very good news this week. Amazing images out of the Air Force Base that they greeted Vice President Harris, and President Biden went to greet the prisoners who had been released late on Thursday night. So all good news that they've been able to be released. Of course, fellow journalist Evan Gershkovich, as you mentioned, was one of them. But they did include Germany received 12 prisoners who were held in Russia back to them. This was a really extensive switch. And some people did have to, we released some folks that there's some backlash, I'd say, from Republicans over the fact that these multiple Russians were released. Some were being held in Slovenia for espionage charges. Some were arrested in Norway also on espionage charges, accused of spying for Russia. There was somebody in Poland who was accused of also spying for Russia. There was also a Russian hacker who was a credit card fraudster. Additionally, a Russian businessman who was involved in a hacking scheme in the US. And then somebody in Estonia who was arraigned on charges of smuggling American technology to Russians military and to their government. So some of these people, are, our government obviously argues that they were not wrongfully detained, that their detainment was legitimate, unlike the people that Russia had, Evan and Paul, that they were wrongfully detained. So, of course, there's going to be back and forth over if this was a fair swap. But interesting to look at some of the backstory over who these prisoners were. But, of course, like we said, good news that the Americans were able to come home last night.
Yes, certainly good news. We know that during a press conference, President Biden reflected that good news, praising our allies for their support in securing the release of American prisoners. But he also seemingly took a jab at former President Trump in the process. And the former president was quick to lash out about the deal on Truth Social. And his running mate, J.D. Vance, also suggested the deal was a testament to Trump's strength despite the deal obviously taking place under the Biden administration. Alex, how is the Trump campaign using this exchange, the prisoner exchange, to boost support among their own campaign and Republicans?
Yeah, it's been interesting how they've spun this. It sounds like their argument from Trump, from Vance, from what we're seeing also from allies, is that basically Vladimir Putin was nervous, I guess, about a next Trump presidency and preparing for that. So that's why he agreed to this prisoner swap. Of course, this happened during the Biden administration, like you mentioned. So, it really is subject to, if you want to, have Trump's back throughout this process, you'll believe that rhetoric. But of course, the Biden administration is going to want to use this as a huge legacy item for the president, that he was able to secure the release of these prisoners in the last 6 months of him in office, and they're ready to take 100% credit for it and for the hard work that the president and vice president put into securing this release. But Republicans are using this as, a testament to former President Trump's influence on the world stage, that this happened during our election season with Trump as, the potential next president.
So we know that Biden obviously completed this very complicated 7-country prisoner exchange that was 6 months out from leaving office. How long had the president been working on this deal, and what else is on the president's agenda to accomplish before the end of the year?
Yeah, so this was a long time coming. The White House has said time and time again for several months now, even years, that they've been really focused on releasing Americans wrongfully detained abroad. But something like this is also kept so quiet that while the administration can say, yes, we're working on it, they can't give out details because of just how fragile a situation like this is. One interesting tidbit that we heard is the day that Biden decided to drop his reelection bid, he just an hour before was working on securing this deal so that him dropping out of the race didn't mess anything up, that he made sure that things were in line for the prisoner swap to happen yesterday. So he's been laser focused on this. And like we were saying, this is part of his legacy. This was something that he wanted to accomplish before leaving office. Other things on his agenda for the next 6 months is he wants to end the conflict in the Middle East. He's been talking to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We actually saw the Prime Minister here in Washington last week. And a lot of those conversations has been stressing that this hostage deal, which would lead to an eventual ceasefire in the Middle East, needs to be accepted so that there's no more fighting, so that the suffering in Gaza can end. Of course, the president has pushed for a 2-state solution as the overall, ultimate ending to this conflict. But I think that that's a huge legacy item that he really wants to accomplish in 6 months, is for the end of the fighting there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Alexandra Tano, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Julia.
A disciplinary committee has recommended a 2-year law license suspension for a Trump DOJ official. The D.C. Bar panel handed down the recommendation on Jeffrey Clark, a central figure in former President Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Clark has been charged with attempted dishonesty and serious interference with the administration of justice after he tried to send a proof of concept letter to Georgia election officials. Clark urged the state to interfere with results that showed Trump losing, though Clark says he believed sending the letter was the right thing to do. The recommendation comes as Clark has been seen as a potential pick for a senior level position in the Trump cabinet if former President Trump is elected for a second term. Venezuela's National Electoral Council has declared the incumbent president Nicolas Maduro has won the election, notably not pushing the precinct-level results from voting machines. And now the U.S. has recognized Maduro's challenger, Edmundo González Urrutia, as the victor. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Venezuela's opposition candidate won the most votes and condemned what he called the deeply flawed election results. The Biden administration is calling on the council to publish the voting data, saying it supports reestablishing democratic norms in autocratic-ruled Venezuela. At least 6 people have died during anti-Maduro protests following the election, with hundreds of others arrested. The unemployment rate has spiked to 4.3% as the U.S. added 114,000 jobs in July. This is according to new data released by the Labor Department Friday. Economists expected new jobs to total 175,000 jobs and the employment rate to steady at 4.1%. Healthcare and construction saw the largest job gains, while information and technology sectors lost jobs. The latest numbers adds to the fear that the labor market is slowing, putting an economy at risk of recession. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.